I tried to follow up what Renzo and Martin said. We said that the civil EU presidency aims at amplifying the voice of civil society and science. The two presentations were more from the scientific sector. I tried to be more the civil society sector. I tried to explain that wilderness protection and old growth, how they are linked together in the EU policy and how they could be linked to the EU nature restoration law, and try to speed up as well in order to allow some questions at the end of our session. So I will talk a little bit about the wilderness definition, wild areas, wilderness in the EU, more linked to the policy element, old growth and primary forest. Probably I can shorten because we heard quite a lot from Renzo and Martin about this and how these are linked to the various EC policies and science in decision making. I leave a last example at the last presentation. I always try to break presentation with some pictures that are coming from Gregoire Dubois. So I should say thank you to him. So what is wilderness, and is it possible to reestablish wilderness? Basically, you can read of the definition. I'm not reading the definition, but very shortly, wilderness in our definition is a management approach. It's not a stage or not a current stage of forest, but more of a management approach, which is basically non-intervention management. And it could actually be re-established through rewilding, which already were mentioned in the Wildcard project. That's why we were actually competing with Renzo and in a proposal. Unfortunately, our project was not selected, but we are really glad that there is a rewilding project going on forest now with the Wildcard. So wilderness areas or wilderness management could be re-established through rewilding. That's in short the conclusion. So basically, we at Wild Europe, we developed a continuum of from wild to wilderness. So there is a definition of wilderness and there is a definition of wild area. Wild areas have a predominance of natural processes and natural habitats. So again, what you have to see is that wilderness is, let's say, at the end of the management spectrum, and then from an urban area to wild, we can end up in with the wilderness area. How we presented this in the rewilding discussions. So basically, at the one end, you can see the urban cities, if this works, urban area, very unnatural, very intensive, and then there is intensive use land. And through agricultural landscape, semi-natural areas, a cultural wildland, we can end up with wilderness. So basically, what we did, and the reason why I'm actually presenting is the continuum of human modification is here. We did a presentation, or actually a publication on rewilding principles. This is where we actually presented this continuum of wilderness. With the increasing degree of naturalness and remoteness, we can end up with pristine wilderness through rewilding. So that's how the continuum is actually built. Yeah. And in the wilderness in the EU, in terms of policy, actually took quite some years, more than a decade. I don't know whether any of you were there. Maybe Toby were there at this Abruzzo visit, which we organized in the framework of Ben Parks Foundation, which disappeared since then. But in the Abruzzo National Park, we actually organized Majala National Park. We organized the VIP trip to some of the decision makers. We tried to explain to them that even in a heavily cultural landscape of Italy, wilderness could exist. And that visit actually resulted in a resolution on wilderness. It was an own resolution, and there is an interesting link to Hungary here. It was an own resolution by Gyula Hegyi, who was a Hungarian MEP at that time. Following up that resolution, the EU actually started two projects. One was the Wilderness Register, which was coordinated by Wageningen University, if I'm correct, and University of Leeds. This Wilderness Register obviously would require an update because it's already more than a decade old document. So we can argue with the Commission that now it's time to actually renew this Wilderness Register. And they also developed, the Commission also subcontracted a group or a consortium to actually develop a technical report on wilderness and Natura 2000. Because not all the Natura 2000 sites are going to be wilderness, but some at least could be managed as a wilderness area. At the end, after let's say 13 years of this trip to Abruzzo, the new EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 includes actually a commitment to strict protection. 10% of the land, terrestrial area of Europe and the marine area should be strictly protected, which we, at the NGO sector, hopefully, we define as a non-intervention management, as wilderness. So we heard already that old growth forest is quite precious. It's less than 2% of the total forest cover within the European Union. So I would call it as a really precious resource. There are various data obviously available. We already heard from the previous two presentations, so I don't need to actually repeat them. That the definition of old growth forest is different. The definition of strict protection could be different. So it mainly the old growth forest, if you remember the map, which I will also show in the next slide, old growth forest normally remained in hardly accessible, non-economic, normally marginal areas. So all these areas that are flatland, consider for instance Hungary, which is largely flat, we hardly got any really old forest. The productive land, they were really turned into productive forest as well. And this is actually presented somehow in this map, which Francesco Sabatini coordinated. Again, you can see the concentration of old growth forest or primary forest in this up in the north and in around the Carpathian Mountains here. So we heard that there are various definitions of old growth. Buchwald has a definition which he actually defined 10 different levels of naturalness of forest, and he actually brought together the FAO definition, the UNECE definitions, and others. And then he defined old growth forest as an ecosystem on stand scale, distinguished by all trees related structural attributes. Old growth encompasses later stages of stand development that typically differ from earlier stage in a variety of characteristics, which might include tree size, accumulation of dead wood, and a number of canopy layers as well. The EEA, the European Environment Agency, came up with a different definition, and we at Wild Europe, we didn't actually develop a definition. We actually developed definition structure which could be applied on national level in the various countries. So old growth forest, my conclusion of the first two presentations was that old growthness could be increased and old growth forest could be re-established as well. And for this purpose, we actually use the restoration or rewilding. Rewilding is more a kind of passive process when we let forest to grow. Restoration could be a more active process where we actually increase the old growthness, maybe removing former plantation forest and invasive species as well from a productive forest. But anyhow, restoration and rewilding and creating old growthness will require a paradigm shift in thinking. That's what we are really sure about. And rewilded ecosystem, wherever possible, should be self-sustaining. So again, this is how we can link old growth forest to wilderness or non-intervention management, that we believe that one of the first principles of forest, that a normal natural forest could be self-sustaining. So the EU biodiversity strategy, it's actually linked to the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework, the one that was approved in Montreal, or they call it Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This CBD framework also defines 30% protection as a global aim. And actually the EU biodiversity strategy with the 30% protection of terrestrial and marine area reflects the CBD targets. And a little bit goes beyond, because actually it defines this 10% strict protection target, which would apply to every habitat type, including freshwater habitats, forests, whatever. And then we already heard from Marco that there are other elements in the EU biodiversity strategy that relates to forest, the forest monitoring law that is still under discussion, the nature restoration law, which had quite a turbulent way of approving it. The deforestation regulation, which it seems will be postponed, unfortunately. And then, or maybe we as NGOs, we can do something about this postponement. And the strategy, basically it's a soft law, it's a political commitment, and legally it's really hard to enforce. But, the nature restoration law actually has very clear targets. And if we, implement, or try to implement the political commitment of 10% strict protection and the total protection of old-growth forest, we can do it through the nature restoration law because this is a binding legislation. And we already heard from Marco, this figure, just to go a little bit to the financing, €1 investment. Some of the study says that it brings €8 benefit. And Carl, earlier you found, in the ECOS publication that basically they also say that through the ecosystem services, non-timber value could be roughly 8 times higher than the timber value of forest. And during the coming day, I think at the end of today, in the last session, we will hear more about the benefits of ecosystem services and benefits of wilderness. So, what could be the strict protection target for forest and for wilderness? That's the big question, because again, I'd like to highlight that 10% applies to all the terrestrial areas, including cities, heavily managed agricultural land, and intensive forest management and intensively used land in general. So, if we remember in Marco's presentation, he said that roughly 40% of all the forests in Europe within the EU are publicly owned. So it's owned by basically us, the taxpayers. If we consider this public and forest versus private forest, I kind of did a very quick check of the various countries. Obviously, the 40% applies to the total EU. In Austria, this is 19%. In Hungary, it's roughly 56%. In Poland, almost 80% of the forests are publicly owned. And they are typically managed by state forest companies. At least I guess that in most of the countries, public forests are managed by state forest companies, or maybe even national park authorities or national park directorates. And formally, in most of the countries, state forest companies have a task that goes far beyond delivering only timber. They have to deliver other wider public benefits as well. They don't have to focus only on timber production. So basically, I would argue that if we do a very simple arithmetical, mathematical calculation, 10% strict protection of all the terrestrial area would mean that roughly 15% of all the forests in Europe should be strictly protected, which means basically non-intervention. Also, it mentioned in the EU guideline actually that strict protection in most of the habitat types would mean non-intervention management. And again, this is linked to a 10% political commitment that was made by our political masters. So it's not an NGO argument, but again, it's a very strong political commitment. Can this be actually delivered through any minimal socio-economic conflict? And if you remember the 40% figure, I would say yes. The answer to this question is yes. Delivering the 15% strict protection is very likely possible through public forest protection. So we can protect a large piece in Austria, almost all of the public forest. In Hungary, roughly maybe 1/3 of the public forest strictly protected. In Poland, even less percentage in order to reach the 15%. And again, the discussion is, we don't really have to compensate anyone because we are the owners. So if we, as the taxpayer, decide that this should be done, we just have to convince our political masters that that's the way forward. So that's basically where I would end with the forest protection. But then I'd like to highlight one element. Again, the two scientific presentation before mine actually confirmed that this old-growth forest and wilderness protection would be needed as a baseline and to deliver biodiversity and carbon benefits for the society. And I think science basically supports what I was talking about, the 15% strict protection. But what I'm kind of fear a little bit, and I'd like to refer to the EU deforestation regulation, which is now postponed. But I would like to refer also to the WWOOF discussion that goes on. I'm really afraid that currently most of the decision making in Europe seems not to be based, or somewhat at least, not really on scientific evidences. And the degradation of protection of WWOOF is a classic example when actually without any scientific evidence, the Commission submits a proposal to member states, and the member states support it to downgrade the protection status of a species. If they do it with WWOOF, which species will be the next, or which habitat will be the next? That's a big question. And I think scientific evidence is also sometimes ignored in the discussions in the forest monitoring law discussions, but it was also discussed very largely in the Renewable Energy Directive, where actually the GRC, the EU-owned scientists, proved and argued that primary woody biomass should not be considered as a renewable energy source, but at the end, with some restriction, actually ended up as, unfortunately, as one of the accepted renewable energy sources. But we'll hear more about this after this session. Yes, and that's